All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at disentangling task interference within neurons, model merging in alignment with neuronal mechanisms. So basically it's all about finding smarter ways to, take the smarts from different AI models and kind of like put them all together without starting from scratch.
Yeah, exactly. It builds on this idea of pre-trained models, these like huge AI systems trained on massive amounts of data. They kind of have a general understanding, and then we can fine tune them like to specialize in certain tasks, right? Like you could have a language model that becomes an expert in, say, legal documents or medical research, something like that. But the problem is sometimes when they specialize, they kind of forget some of their original broader skills.
Yeah, like you train an AI to be a master chef and suddenly it forgets how to boil water.
Yeah. So the challenge is how to build AI that's versatile, a real jack of all trades, but master of many. One way is multitask learning, basically training one model on a bunch of different tasks at the same time. But that gets really demanding in terms of computing power and data, and there can be privacy concerns with all that data. So model merging is like a shortcut. You take several models, each already fine-tuned for its own task, and try to smush them together cleverly without any more training, like a team up of AI specialists.
So this paper tackles a big problem in model merging, right? This idea of task interference. Like when you combine these specialist models, their knowledge can clash, right? And the merged model ends up being worse than the individuals. What's cool here is they're not just treating the models like black boxes, they're going down to the level of individual neurons. It's like super granular.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to understand the brain of the AI. And the idea is if we know how each neuron changes when it learns a specific task, then maybe we can merge models in a way that reduces these conflicts. They call this new technique NeuroMerging. And it's all about aligning those neurons, seeing how similar or different they are across the models, no extra training required, which is a big plus.
So the potential here is pretty huge, right? More versatile AI models, better performance on all sorts of tasks from image recognition to language processing. But maybe even more exciting is what this tells us about how AI actually learns, like how is knowledge stored and combined within these networks. It could be a big step towards making AI more understandable and, well, less of a mystery.
Absolutely. And it gives us new ways to deal with that pesky task interference problem, which has been a thorn in the side of AI research for a while.
Okay, so before we dive into the specifics of neuromerging, I kind of want to zoom out for a sec.
Yeah.
What led to this research? Like, what were the stepping stones that made this whole neuron level approach possible?
Well, a lot of it goes back to the success of transfer learning, right? Being able to pre-train these massive models and then adapt them to specific tasks. This created a whole ecosystem of specialized AI models. And with platforms like Hugging Face making it easy to share these models, well, merging them started to look like a really efficient way to build powerful AI without starting from scratch each time.
So basically, we had all these ingredients, all these specialized models ready to be combined. But what about the challenges? What were researchers struggling with?
Right. The early methods for model merging were pretty basic, like just averaging the weights of different models. But that often led to, well, mediocre performance because of that task interference. Think of it like mixing paints, right? You can't just dump every color together and expect a masterpiece. Researchers realized they needed more sophisticated techniques to blend these models in a way that preserved the unique expertise of each one.
And this led to, like, different levels of merging, right?
Exactly. Some methods looked at the entire model, using weighted averages, or even trying to do some kind of arithmetic with the weights. Others went deeper, focusing on specific layers within the models and trying to figure out which layers from which model were most useful for the merged model. Then you had parameter level approaches, directly tweaking individual weights based on how important they seemed to be. So it was all about getting more and more precise.
But even at the parameter level, they weren't really looking at individual neurons the way this paper does, right?
Yeah, that's the key difference. Those parameter level methods were kind of like looking at the trees but missing the forest, They treated all the weights within a neuron the same. This paper argues that we need to zoom in even further, see how the entire neuron with all its connections changes when it learns something new. Because ultimately, neurons are the basic building blocks of these networks.
So it's kind of like even though AI has gotten so complex, understanding the individual neuron is still essential.
Yeah, totally. They're like the brain cells of the AI. And understanding them could be the key to unlocking all sorts of new capabilities.
All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. How does neuromerging actually work?
Well, they start with this concept of the neuronal task vector. Imagine you have a neuron in a model that's been fine-tuned for a specific job, right? Now compare the weights of that neuron to the weights of the same neuron in the original pre-trained model. The difference between those two sets of weights, that's the neuronal task vector. It basically tells you how that neuron adapted to learn that particular task.
Okay, so it's like a fingerprint of that neuron's learning for that task, right?
Exactly. And then they do something really clever. They take this neuronal task vector and break it down into two parts, two subspaces. The first is the parallel subspace, which basically tells you how much the neuron's changes align with the original weight space of the pre-trained model. They call this the neuron's sensitivity, how responsive it is to different inputs.
So that's like the part of the neuron that was already kind of primed for learning, right?
Yeah.
Based on the initial training. What about the other subspace?
The second part is the orthogonal subspace. This is all about the changes that are brand new, specific to that new task. It's like how the neuron customized itself to become an expert in that particular area. They call this the neuron's input adaptability, and they use some fancy math, this thing called projection, to separate these two subspaces.
Okay, so for every neuron and every specialized model, they're figuring out what part is like the original sensitivity and what part is the new task-specific adaptation. Then how do they actually merge the models?
So now they have these parallel and orthogonal components for each model, and they merge them separately. For the parallel component, they just use regular techniques like weighted averaging. But for the orthogonal component, they use something called singular value decomposition, or SVD. It's a way to find the most important directions of change within that task-specific adaptation, so they can focus on the most significant modifications. Then they merge those. They also have these dials, scaling parameters, to control how much each subspace contributes to the final merged neuron. These can be fine-tuned if you have some extra data, a validation set. But they also have a neat trick for setting these parameters even without that extra data, based on how much the weights change during fine-tuning. Finally, they take all these merged neuronal task vectors and add them back to the original pre-trained model, and boom, you've got your merged model.
It sounds like a very delicate process, like trying to transplant a brain without messing anything up.
Right. It's all about respecting those subtle differences in how the neurons learned and adapted.
So did this whole neuron level approach actually work?
Oh, yeah. The results were pretty impressive. They tested it on a bunch of different tasks and model architectures, both in NLP and computer vision. For NLP, they used these models called T5 and tested them on 7 different tasks. NeuroMerging consistently beat the other model merging techniques, not only when they had that extra validation data, but even without it. And get this, the merged models even performed well on data sets they had never seen before, stuff outside their training data.
So that's a good sign, right? I mean, it's not just memorizing the specific tasks, it's learning something more general about how to combine knowledge.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They tried it on those huge language models, Llama 2. And they saw big improvements when merging models that were specialized in different areas, like understanding Chinese, solving math problems, and even writing code.
So it works across different types of models too, not just language, but also vision.
Yeah, they used NeuroMerging on those vision transformer models, trained on image recognition tasks. And again, it performed really well, often beating the other merging techniques.
But they did some deeper analysis to see what was really going on, right?
Oh yeah, they really dug into it. One cool thing they found was that their method for setting those merging parameters, even without the validation data, worked the best overall. Which is great, because getting that validation data can be a pain. They also messed around with different ways of actually combining those neuronal task vectors and found one that seemed to work the best, this thing called elect plus mean.
But the really interesting stuff was about those parallel and orthogonal subspaces, right? Like figuring out what each part actually contributes.
Yeah, they did these things called ablation studies, where they basically removed parts of the method to see what would happen. And they found that keeping only the orthogonal subspace, the part with the task-specific adaptations, was enough to get almost perfect performance, and sometimes even better. But keeping only the parallel subspace caused a big drop in performance.
So it's really those task-specific changes, those adaptations, that hold the key to the specialized knowledge, more than just the original sensitivity of the neurons.
Exactly. It tells you something about how these models learn.
So big picture, what does this paper tell us about machine learning, and where do we go from here?
I think the big takeaway is that looking at model merging from the perspective of individual neurons with all their complexity is a really powerful approach. This whole idea of neuronal alignment and how they break down those adaptations into different subspaces, it's a new way of thinking about how we can combine the knowledge of specialized AI models.
So novel notions time. What kind of future research does this inspire? What's next?
Well, one thought is, what if we made those subspaces, the parallel and orthogonal ones, more dynamic? Instead of being fixed, what if the model could figure out the most important subspaces for each task during the merging process? Because not all neurons are equally important for every task, right?
So it'd be like the model learns which parts of the neurons are the real stars for each task and focuses on aligning those.
Exactly. It could lead to even better merging, less interference. And maybe it would help us preserve those really complex, subtle forms of knowledge that might get lost with a fixed decomposition. The challenge, of course, would be figuring out how to define and detect those subspaces, how to make the model do that automatically.
It would be like giving the AI the ability to analyze its own brain and figure out the best way to merge with another AI. Pretty wild.
Yeah. I think it's definitely an area with a lot of potential, but it's going to be tough for sure.
Okay, another thought. Any other novel notions brewing?
Well, this paper focuses on single neurons, right? But what if we zoomed out a bit and looked at the connections between neurons, how they interact?
Like a whole social network of neurons.
Exactly, because maybe task interference isn't just about individual neurons being out of whack, but about the whole network of interactions getting messed up during merging. So what if we could identify these like neuronal interaction networks for each task and then merge the models in a way that preserves those interactions?
That sounds really complex, though. Like, how would you even figure out that those interaction networks are?
Yeah, it's definitely a harder problem. We'd need better tools for analyzing how information flows through these networks, maybe using techniques from network science and stuff like that. But if we could crack it, it could lead to some really powerful merged models that retain the complex abilities of the original ones.
So, lots of exciting avenues to explore. It's amazing how much we still don't know about how these AI systems really work.
Yeah, it's like we're just scratching the surface. And the more we understand about those individual neurons and how they interact, the better equipped we'll be to build even more impressive AI in the future.
Well, that's another deep dive in the books. Thanks for joining us as we explored the fascinating world of neuronal alignment and model merging. Be sure to check the description for a link to the paper if you want to get into the weeds. And until next time, keep those neurons firing.